Sprint planning is one of the 4 formal inspect and adapt opportunities of the Scrum framework. It is the first event in a sprint where we answer 3 questions: the why, the what, and the how. In simple terms, it is an opportunity for the Scrum team to collaborate and lay out the work that is forecast for the sprint. All events in Scrum have a time box, a maximum amount of time that an event should take. It is not a minimum or expected amount of time. I've worked with many Scrum teams who achieve the outcome of sprint planning in only an hour or 2. My tip here is not to rush. We can easily get through something quickly, but when you're focused on just getting it over with, you will lose the value of the event. For sprint planning, if you're working within a 1-month sprint, it has a time box of 8 hours. If your sprint is shorter, the time box will typically decrease in line with the length of your sprint. The sprint planning event is attended by all of the Scrum team, the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the developers. If needed, external experts may be invited to support the developers in their planning, but this isn't very common. The inputs to a successful sprint planning event are the ordered product backlog, information about current market conditions, an objective or hypothesis for a potential sprint goal, and an expected capacity of the developers. The outputs of a successful sprint planning are transparency over what is required to move forward towards value, and a sprint backlog taking the form of the sprint goal, product backlog items forecast to be needed, and the developer's plan of how to turn these product backlog items into a usable increment. Now, I said that there are 3 questions that are answered during a sprint planning event, the first of which was why. Why is this sprint valuable? This is the opportunity for the product owner to present their objective or hypothesis to the rest of the Scrum team, explain why it will be valuable to work on during the upcoming sprint, and collaborate with the Scrum team using the inputs I mentioned a moment ago. If the developers don't believe the objective is possible, they need to have the courage to challenge the product owner and then work together to negotiate this objective into something achievable. Once we have an achievable goal that is transparent and understood, we have a sprint goal. The developers commit to this sprint goal being achieved within the next sprint. Whilst I said that the output of a successful sprint planning event was the sprint backlog, and that is certainly true, the minimum expected output is a formulated and transparent sprint goal. What I mean by this is that there is no expectation that the sprint backlog is fully formulated. After all, we might not know how to achieve it at the start of the sprint. But without a sprint goal, the upcoming sprint would be aimless. The second question that is answered in the sprint planning event is what? What can be done this sprint? Based on the understanding of the sprint goal that has just been committed to, the developers will pull in product backlog items from the product backlog and perhaps create any new ones that are needed to form a list of forecasted items needed to achieve the sprint goal. Part of this process is likely to include further refinement and collaboration with the product owner, but the purpose of question 2, what can be done this sprint, is to produce a forecasted plan. This is perhaps the most challenging part of sprint planning because it requires the developers to understand their capacity and the art of the possible within their skill set and time available. They also need to consider their definition of done and what is expected of the increment at the end of the sprint. Over time, this forecasting will become easier for a mature, self-managing Scrum team. The final question, question 3, is how? How will this chosen work get done? And this is where the developers, considering the forecasted plan made up of individual product backlog items, they will discuss and plan how they can be turned into a usable increment. This may involve further decomposition of product backlog items into more manageable tasks. This process is entirely at the discretion of the developers. However, it is often beneficial that product backlog items are decomposed into smaller items of 1 day or less. This is because progress is easier to inspect and consequently adapt for during the daily Scrum. All of these 3 questions together, once they have been answered successfully and transparently across the entire Scrum team, are referred to as the sprint backlog. This sprint backlog, specifically the sprint goal, should be a measurable step towards the product goal. To wrap up this topic, I want you to create your own sprint backlog. I know we attempted something similar during our topic on the sprint goal, but bear with me, as this activity will have a small difference. You are going to create a sprint backlog for tidying your house. I want you to write a sprint backlog for you, your partner, and anyone you live with for what is needed to achieve that sprint goal. You know your capacity and likely know your definition of done for housework. Pause the video and create your sprint backlog now. Okay, so you have a sprint backlog, a list of requirements to achieve the sprint goal of tidying your house. But imagine you're halfway through the sprint and you and the people you live with have made progress on tidying your house. That's great. However, you've discovered an impediment as you've progressed. In sprint planning, you made a forecast, and so far you have been faithfully executing product backlog items from that list. But I want you to consider that as you progress down that list, you noticed a significant leak of water under your floorboards. What do? Pause the video again and adapt your sprint backlog as necessary to take into account this new learning. Now, it doesn't matter what adaptations you took into account. You might have decided to call a plumber, grab some towels to soak up the water, or even open the doors to let it air out. The key is that any adaptations you made should not have endangered the sprint goal. As long as your sprint goal remained the same, you and the people you lived with adapted your plan based on the information you had at the time. You had no idea during sprint planning that you were going to find a leak, and therefore you could never have forecasted that into your plan. And that is the reality of complex work. The takeaway from this section is that the purpose of sprint planning is to make a forecast. The developers do not commit to anything other than the sprint goal because there is too much uncertainty and risk to do so. As teams become more confident and more mature, you will find that sprint planning runs more smoothly. It's common for a Scrum Master to facilitate the event, however, there is absolutely no expectation that he or she will do so. In actual fact, you may find it more successful and a more collaborative sprint planning event if it is less facilitated and more of an organic experience.